just garlic. From candles to potpourri, the possibilities are plentiful. Master potter Bill Van Gilder will demonstrate how to make one of these great pieces out of stoneware clay right now on DIY's Throwing Clay. Throwing clay is Bill Van Gilder's passion. He's been working at the wheel for more than 3 decades. Designing creative, functional clayware like this jar is his forte.
When I make this garlic jar, I'm going to share with you some new techniques. One is how to create this lid, which is a humped lid, or a dome lid, made like a shallow bowl off of a hump of clay. Second thing I'm going to show you is how to create this knob. We kind of sculpt it out of wet clay and attach it to the leather hard lid. And the third thing, a new technique, is how to create this gallery. We're going to split the rim, creates a lid seating which supports the lid on the finished piece. First thing we've got to do is get our clay ready.
To make the garlic jar, you'll need 2½ pounds of clay, a ruler, a sponge on a stick, an undercutting rib, a cut-off wire, a hole cutter, a trimming tool, a sanding pad, a dust mask, wax-resist emulsion, and glazes.
So let's go over to the wheel and get to work. This garlic jar is made in 3 pieces. The jar, the lid, and the knob. We start by making a cylinder, which becomes the jar.
First, Bill centers and opens 1½ pounds of clay to create the cylinder.
I'm going to create the gallery, or the ledge, on which the lid will sit inside the rim. And to do that, I need a lot of clay up there. So as my fingertips come upward, they stop short of the rim, and I compress it, creating quite a thickness up there. I'm pushing downward, but I'm also capturing it with my thumb tip and my fingertip just beneath the rim. And after each pull, I level the rim and thicken it up again. Now I'm going to split this rim into its gallery. I'm going to start with using the side of my thumb, divide the rim in half, and slightly push down. I'm also supporting it underneath on the outside. I'm going to refine it using the rounded tip of this sculpting tool.
There are several ways to form galleries. Bill's put other methods to make lid seatings on DIYnetwork.com.
The next step is to give the jar its final form. A slight pressure from the insides, supported by these outside fingers, rounds out the jar.
Bill squeezes the neck of the jar slightly before taking the first measurement.
I'm looking for 3½ inches from the inside rim to the inside rim. It's a little big. But before I push it in and adjust it, I'm going to finish the form of the jar itself.
Bill pushes the clay against the straight edge of the rib to give the jar a clean, round profile.
Very carefully, I'm going to compress this rim. Three and a half inches, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm going to use a sponge on a stick, remove the excess water from the inside of the jar. Clean up all the edges with the tip of the sponge.
Bill cuts the jar from the wheel head. With dry hands, he lifts it to the wear board.
Next step, throw the lid.
When DIY's Throwing Clay continues, a shallow bowl becomes a lid. Welcome back to Throwing Clay. Bill is making a garlic jar. With 1½ pounds of clay, he threw a cylinder with a very thick rim. Then he split the rim in half by pressing down with his thumb, making sure to support the rim with his outside fingers. Next, he shaped the cylinder into a rounded form. He adjusted the neck so it measured 3½ inches across. Then he removed the excess water from inside the jar and cleaned up the edges with a sponge. Now Bill is ready to throw the lid off a hump of clay.
I've centered a 1-pound piece of clay, and I'm going to create a doorknob at the top by tucking my right hand underneath the rim. Pressure down in the center and pull it out into a bowl shape. And this is where we start measuring. has to come out about 1/4 of an inch. So my outside fingers are going to tuck up underneath the lid a little bit more, compress a little bit more, and pull that clay outward.
Bill measures the lid again.
3.5 inches, and that's what I'm looking for. The thickness of this lid is about the same thickness, slightly less than 1/4 of an inch, of the walls of the pot. I keep the rim rather sturdy also.
The rim of the lid is slightly thicker than 1/4 of an inch. It's the part that comes in contact with the jar, so it should be strong.
Now I've got to get this lid off its hump. I'm going to take, again, my undercutting tool, and I'm going to use this point. Place it underneath the lid and push in a little bit to create a groove. Now into that groove, I'm going to strike the wire right through. Wet my fingertips, slide them underneath the lid, and pick it up.
Bill sets the jar and the lid aside to dry until they're stiff leather hard.
The garlic jar and the lid are now really stiff leather hard, and that's important because we're going to handle them a lot. If we change this circle, the lid's not going to fit.
Bill will trim the bottom of the jar first. Rather than throwing a clay trimming pad, he's going to use a clay slab. He trims it round and marks it with guidelines.
If you're not real good at throwing a flat pad, this is a time saver. I'm going to pat it down just lightly, just enough to stick it to the pad.
With the looped trimming tool, Bill softens the edge at the base of the jar.
And the final step is to smooth this off completely. I'm going to add a little bit of water with a sponge and use this soft rubber rib. Press it against the wall of the pot and kind of burnish it. One final wipe with a sponge. That's pretty much finished. I've now got to trim the top of the lid and attach a knob. But you know, once I've attached it to the pad and put a wet knob on top of it, how do I get it off the pad? I'm going to cut a keyhole. That allows this finger to get underneath the rim and pop it up when we're finished. Got to think ahead just a little bit here. Now I'm going to trim this, not dead flat, a little bit of an arch to it. I'm trying to copy the inside shape of the lid, which is domed. So I'm going to create a dome here.
The trimming tool raises the aggregate in the clay, so Bill smooths the trimmed area with his fingertip.
All right, the next step is to create a little scoring mark, or a little roughness to the top of the lid. I'm using the point of this undercutting tool to do that. Now this scoring will make it really easy to attach that knob, which is wet clay, to this lid, which is now leather hard. It'll give the clay a grip.
Coming up next on DIY's Throwing Clay, Bill sculpts a super knob to top off the jar. Master potter Bill Van Gilder is making a garlic jar. So far, he's thrown a cylinder with 1.5 pounds of clay. He fashioned a very thick rim and split it in half by pressing down with his thumb. Then he pushed out the belly of the cylinder to give the jar its shape. He measured the opening and adjusted the neck to be 3.5 inches across. Next, Bill threw a lid upside down off a 1-pound hump of clay. First, he made a doorknob of clay at the top of the hump. He opened the doorknob by pressing in the very center and then stretched the clay to form a shallow bowl. He measured the bowl, or upside-down lid, to make sure it was 3.5 inches across. Then he cut it free from the hump. He set the two pieces aside until they were stiff leather hard. Then he trimmed the base of the jar on a clay slab. He trimmed the top side of the lid, taking care to mimic the shallow bowl shape inside the lid. Finally, he scored the area where he'll attach the knob to the lid. In preparation for throwing the knob, Bill soaks the scored area with water.
Now while this water soaks in, creates a tacky surface there, I'm going to roll up, oh boy, about a 2-ounce piece of clay. Now I don't want any divots. I want this surface that's going to contact the lid to be really smooth. If we had divots in there, it would trap air, and eventually the lid and the knob would come apart. Now we're going to give this knob some shape. It's a little too much clay. That knob's going to be too large for this lid. So I'm just going to peel some off the top with my fingertip.
With his index and middle fingers, Bill shapes the knob, topping it off with a swirl.
And lastly, I'm going to use this rubber rib again and burnish the surface of the lid. I've created a little mark right here at the foot of the knob. That sort of separates visually that knob from the lid. And that's an aesthetic decision on my part. Now the knob itself, it can't be shaped like this. Your fingers will just slide off of it when you're trying to remove it from the jar. So I actually lean out the edges from the bottom to the top. Your fingers can get around it. That's one thing. The other thing is I've actually pointed the top of the knob, and that has to do with the overall design of this project. Let me show you what I mean. I look for a profile line from the foot up to the shoulder, all the way to the point of the knob, and back down again. That's what makes this jar aesthetically and visually pleasing. Now we're going to cut the holes in the jar. Now I'm going to cut this pattern, show you how I do it. But you know, this is what sets up the design of this piece. Here's one I did earlier, different pattern. They're not alike, and they don't have to be. That's what's cool about this project. I tend to want to work in front of me as opposed to down low. So we're going to raise up the piece on this banding wheel. Now before I start cutting the holes, I'm going to put a line on the side of the pot. And this is a guideline. You'll see what I mean. That little line won't show up once we get a glaze covered. I'm going to remove this lid so I have somewhere to hold my left hand. First cut is right along that line I just made. I work on the pot like a clock. 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12, and 6. So there's my 3 o'clock. There's my 9, my 12, and my 6. From those points, I start building.
Working symmetrically around the jar, Bill creates a pattern of holes. He perforates the pot with a hole cutter.
It's a tapered blade. It's also rounded. What I'm estimating is the part of the blade that is not pushed into the jar. It takes a little bit of practice to understand that.
By watching how much of the blade remains outside the wall of the pot, Bill cuts holes that are all the same diameter.
Now I've done this pattern many times in my studio. Best thing to do is make a few dot drawings until you have a pattern you like. Then start to apply it to the pot. That's the top half of the pattern completed. I'm now going to move this same pattern downward. Now it's important that this pot at this stage is a stiff leather hard. That means these beads of clay release from the tool really easily. If it were still too wet, this would clog up with all these beads and you'd have a real mess on your hands. Now there's one more thing I'm going to do with this tool, and that's on the lid. This knob is quite a lump of clay, and it's very possible that if I fire it too fast in the kiln, it'll explode. So I'm going to put a release, an air release, underneath the lid. That evens out the wall thickness. Means the steam or the water can evaporate through that hole from the inside of the knob. All right, I'm going to let it set up until it's bone dry, then get it into the kiln for its first firing.
When DIY's throwing clay continues, Bill overlaps a couple of earthy colors to complement the jar. Welcome back to Throwing Clay. Bill is making a garlic jar. He started by throwing a cylinder with a very thick rim. Then he split the rim in half to form the gallery or ledge for the lid. To give the jar its rounded shape, he pushed out the belly. Then he measured the opening of the jar. He had to squeeze it gently to make it 3.5 inches across. Next, Bill threw the lid off a hump of clay. He threw the lid upside down. Starting with a doorknob of clay, he opened it to form a shallow bowl. He measured the bowl to make sure it was 3.5 inches across. Then he cut the lid free from the hump. When the lid and the jar were stiff leather hard, he trimmed them on a clay slab. Next, he he scored the lid and soaked the area with water. He rolled a small ball of clay and attached the smooth surface to the scored area on the lid. With his fingertip, he shaped the knob. Then he cut the holes in the wall of the jar. He used a guide line and worked around the pot in a symmetrical fashion. When he'd completed the pattern, he cut an air hole in the lid at the base of the knob. Now that the pieces are bone dry, Bill loads them into the kiln for their first firing. The kiln heats up over 10 to 12 hours to about 1750 degrees, then cools for another 24 hours before Bill can unload the jar. Now he's ready to glaze the project.
I picked two really earthy glazes to use on this garlic jar. One is this nutmeg color, the other is this blue. Now, one thing I discovered by running some glaze tests is that when I cross this blue over this nutmeg, I get this even more earthy blue tone. They're perfect for this project. First thing I've got to do is get this pot, or certain parts of it, waxed. That's going to resist the glaze so the lid won't stick to the jar. I'm going to prop it up with this other piece of bisqueware. I'll let that dry.
Bill waxes the bottom of the jar. Then he waxes the gallery where the lid will sit during the high temperature firing.
In about 2 or 3 minutes, these wax surfaces will be dry. So while they're drying, I'm going to set up the glazes. Two and a half to 3 seconds. 1, 2 and a half, and out. Now, I made a decision about how I'm going to combine these two glazes. I'm going to use the blue at the bottom, the nutmeg at the top. That means I don't have to submerge this whole thing into the glaze. I'm going to wet my fingertips a little bit. That makes them stick to the bisqueware. I'm going to dip down 2/3 of the way.
Bill divides the jar in thirds with the two glaze colors. It's a subtle design trick that keeps the pot looking lively. He's put more glaze design tips on DIYnetwork.com.
I've got to make sure that none of these holes get blocked up with glaze.
Bill fettles the lid and the gallery before making the second dip.
Okay, now I'm going to switch glazes and get the blue glaze ready to apply. Now, one thing that's pretty obvious to me, there's no glaze in the bottom of this pot. And that's all right. Garlic isn't a liquid, so we can get away with it. I'm just crossing over with the blue into the nutmeg, a little bit less than 1/2 inch. Now, what's missing here is the blue at the top, but I want to surround it with nutmeg, so I'm going to apply some wax at the rim of this lid and then make a quick dip in the blue. You know, if I didn't apply this wax on the lid and I dipped it into the blue, it would most likely coat the whole thing. So this kind of controls it, makes it look neat. Okay, into the blue. There, it's pretty obvious where I waxed. Last thing is to clean up this foot. Let's go put it in the kiln, see how it fires.
Bill loads the garlic jar into the kiln for the high temperature firing. He fires the jar with the lid in place to keep it round. The kiln heats up over 10 to 12 hours to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it cools for at least 24 hours before Bill unloads it.
I make these jars for garlic, but you can also use them as a potpourri pot. And they make a great lantern too. These holes throw a terrific pattern across the walls. Just remember, don't burn it with the lid in place. I'm Bill Van Gilder. Have fun in the studio.